Hello, and welcome to my short podcast on Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, specifically Chapter 2. Little context about the Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that Paulo Freire was born in Brazil, was raised there, became an educator there, but post 1964 coup of Brazil, when the government was taken over by a more militant style of government, who found Freire's teachings very subversive. He was imprisoned for 70 days and then exiled. He wrote this book while on exile and was allowed to come back 15 years later, and during which he lived in short period in Bolivia, Chile, invited to Geneva as well. He's a very prolific educator and someone who really educated people and raised the literacy rates of Brazil his entire life, frankly. And chapter 2 of the banking and about the book itself is that its reception wise, it was banned in many places actually, but most notably, in my opinion, in South Africa, because this was during the time of apartheid, and the people who were supporters of apartheid and even like post-apartheid, people who supported that form of thinking were did think that firstly books were a way of spreading revolutionary and, in their case, incendiary knowledge, and therefore books were already and discouraged. And then you have Paulo Freire discussing liberatory revolutionary practices in the form of education and educating their children. It was not a great sight. And essentially the argument that Freire makes is he discusses the banking approach to education. He proposes an alternate model called the problem posing approach instead. He discusses the consequences and the reasons that a banking approach to education would be important, and he concludes it by discussing concluding that education is liberation and to learn is to be human. And my favorite quote in this is, without communication, human life holds no meaning. And this idea is propagated throughout the entire paper. The central argument he discusses is firstly that the banking model of education is one that transforms students into receptacles and who have knowledge merely quote unquote deposited onto them by teachers. And the teacher has a very authoritarian role. The teacher is absolute and the student is meek. Also, what's interesting is, by calling it the banking model of education, is that, banks are a place where you deposit money. And in this metaphor, I suppose that knowledge is likened to money. And what is money the most associated with, I suppose, is profit. And already Freire is, I think, making a very anti-capitalist argument about the idea of education and knowledge being seen only for profit instead of profit, rather than being something that can really change the situations of people, because it says one of the signs of an oppressor of the banking approach to education is that there is only a need to change the consciousness of the oppressed rather than the situation that oppresses them. And this argument is taken further in discussing the idea that the humanism of the banking approach masks the effort to turn women and men into automatons, the very negation of their ontological vocation to be more human. I'll come back to this point later, but this is another point that this further materializes, is that this is a form of oppression. And when you create men and women who can't think for themselves, you create people who are easily dominated. And this oppression, which is seen in the form of overwhelming control, quote, is necrophilic. It is nourished by a love of death, not of life. And this idea of a love of life is referenced in one of Freire's letters to a group of school children, and in which he says, "I promise I will never stop loving children. I love life too much," which I think is really adorable. And this is then followed on to the idea of revolutionary thought and revolutionary practice, where he, quote unquote, says, Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in men. Education is the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination. It denies the and education denies this kind of education denies that the man is abstract, isolated, and independent, and unattached to the world. And it also denies the world that exists as a reality apart from people. Problem posing education is an attempt for people to be more human, and humanization and dehumanization is extremely important to, well, my response to this is because I think that a few of the scholars that I chose to respond to this with is, firstly, Donna Haraway with her Cyborg Manifesto, and Angela Davis with her work about women, race, class, and slavery. And firstly, is that Freire does very explicitly make clear this idea of the banking model being a mechanization of the human. And, well, Donna Haraway in the Cyborg Manifesto talks about this mechanization of the human as a form of liberation, and it's very important to her to move past usual models of segregation and separation, so class, gender, race. Stuff like this is transcended by mechanization and cyborg theory, essentially. While Angela Davis, on the other hand, Freire describes the mechanization, not like Freire, but Davis does talk about the mechanization of the slave as being a way that the slave women especially were objectified and given an object status. And the more organic slavers and humans were more human, and mechanizing the slaves because they were machines. They were meant to just do, and they were not meant to be human. And there is this, I think Freire is very conscious of this, state of being and the state of being human, because he does say that firstly, reality is not static. Reality is constantly shifting and constantly changing, number one. And number two, that humanity is unfinished. And to accept that we are unfinished, and to accept that learning and knowledge is not even a way to finish ourselves, but a way to understand that unfinishedness, is really important and I think really beautiful. And that's it for this podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great evening, night, morning. Thank you.